Well, good afternoon, as it is when I'm recording this project here. And I hope my dogs, who are just right off of the side here of me, do not begin to bark too loudly or get all excited. If they are, I will pause it, go back, and then pick it back up again. But I want to talk to us today about King Saul and really the rest from chapter 8 of First Samuel all the way to the end of First Samuel involves the life of King Saul. And interspersed and intertwined in that is the story as well of King David. Although he was not the king at that point, he is um, largely a key figure. I'm going to try to see if I can swing around here just a second. There we go, to where it's not quite as dark. So um, let's begin looking at King Saul, and in our next recording, I will delve into more of David. So there's going to be some parts of this that I'm going to say we will talk about this later. So just so that I'm not, you don't think that I'm completely skipping everything. So um, we come to a transition where Israel asks for a king. And I'm going to try to move this over here again and out of the way. As Samuel got older, the people clamored for a king. That in and of itself was not bad, for God declared that they would have a king all the way back in Abraham. But they wanted a king for the wrong reasons. They wanted a king to go out and fight their enemies instead of allowing God to fight their battles for them. Now that's interesting. And when this happens in chapter 8 here, Samuel takes it personally. He feels that in some ways that they are going against him. And God says, Samuel, they're not rejecting you. They are rejecting me. Let me go back here again. There we go. They're rejecting me. And in fact, God told Samuel not to be dismayed. And the Lord said unto Samuel, hearken unto the voice of the Lord in all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. And so this is tragic in the life of the people of Israel. Samuel, in trying to get the people of Israel to understand what was going on, warned Israelites what would happen if they had a king. The king would enlist the young men into the armies, having the young men run before his chariots, making slave labors, taking the best of your field and vineyards, using your property for personal gain, and demanding a tenth of your harvest and flocks. These are the warnings that Samuel told to the children of Israel, but they wanted a king anyway. And what is sad, every one of these came true. Only one did King Saul do, and that's the very first one, enlisting young men into the army. For we see in this chart here that the prophecy about the king, this is the side that Samuel talked about, and here is the verse chapter and verse and book exactly where this took place. And quite a fascinating um, comparison there. You have Absalom makes his chariots run, or people run before his chariots. Solomon conscript labors to build the temple. Jezebel stole Naboth's vineyard. And Rehoboam, um, he actually was going to demand heavier taxation than Solomon. And so it's quite interesting when you see this. Regardless, even after the warnings, the people wanted a king. And they ignored Samuel's warnings. You see, Samuel's sons, as Eli's sons, were not following God and were not worthy of their father. And in his old age, Samuel appointed them judges, but they didn't do right. Um, and so the advancing of Solomon's age and his son's corruption, the people wanted a new type of leadership. Now, what is interesting to note, the people did not blame Solomon or Samuel for his son's ways. Nevertheless, they were ready for a replacement. And so we have the picture of Saul becoming king. Entered on the stage of life one named Saul. You see, Saul's father had lost his donkeys, and Saul and his servant went to look for them. And their search brought them near to the prophet Samuel, where the prophet Samuel was staying. And since they could not find their donkeys, and we see this here in chapter 9 of 1 Samuel, they go to ask Saul or Samuel for help. And so they make their way, and as Saul was coming with his servant, God tells Samuel that there's a man coming by the name of Saul, and you will anoint him king to be the first king of Israel. Samuel goes to the city gate to await for Saul. Saul comes and he sees Samuel, not recognizing Samuel. He said, could you point me to the house of the seer or the prophet? And Samuel said, I am the seer, I am the prophet. And so he tells Saul to go up before him. He brings him to his house. He feeds Saul and his servant. And after the meal, they talk. And I sort of think that this might have been a job interview. Samuel was making sure that Saul was worthy to be king. And the next day early, Samuel sends Saul back to his house. All right, something was wrong there. It stopped. But Samuel sends Saul back to his own house, and he talks with him some more. And then we notice that when they get to the way, Samuel says, send the servant on ahead. And Samuel anoints King Saul. And he says, by the way, um, your father's donkeys have been found. And I want you to go to Gilgal and wait instructions. Samuel brings the house of God together, and also part of that, the donkeys were found that he would prophesy at the house of God in Bethel. And so we find toward the end of chapter 9 and starting into chapter 10 that Saul or Samuel sends out word and gathers the people to Mizpah, and there he anointed and made Saul king over Israel. And they did it official. They did it by lots. The lots came down to Kish, And they looked for Saul, and they couldn't find Saul. And finally, the Lord says, I know where he's at. He's hiding among the stuff. Now, the stuff there means literally military baggage. And oh, that Saul would have stayed small in his own eyes. But oh, that he would have continued with the humility. But he didn't. He became puffed up. He became impatient and overstepped his rights on many occasions. The Life Application Bible gives this some facts about King Saul that I would like to give. And rather interesting here. They say this, which I think is important before I go to the strengths. First impressions can be deceiving, especially when the image created by a person's appearance is contradicted by his or her qualities. Saul presented the ideal visual image of a king, but the tendency of his character often went contrary to God's command for a king. Saul was God's chosen leader, but this did not mean he was capable of being a king. And so in the Life Application Study Bible, it gives some strengths and accomplishments of King Saul. First of all, Saul, he was the first appointed king of Israel. He was known for his personal courage and generosity. Saul was also, the Bible tells us, stood head and shoulders above everyone else. He had a striking appearance. But his weaknesses were his leadership abilities did not match the expectations created by his appearance. He was impulsive by nature. He tended to overstep his bounds. He was jealous of David. He tried to kill him on numerous occasions. He specifically disobeyed God on several occasions. What are some of the lessons that we can learn from the life of King Saul? God wants obedience from the heart, not mere acts of righteous ritual. Obedience always involves sacrifice, but sacrifice is not always ritual. Obedience always involves sacrifice, but sacrifice is not always obedience. God wants to make use of our strengths and weaknesses. For you see, weaknesses should help us remember our need for God's guidance and help. And so as we look into this, we see then the difference between the prophetic and the priestly approach of historical books. The Bible contains two separate histories of the Israelites' monarch. In fact, the first is found in the books of Samuel and Kings, and the second account is in the books of Chronicles. These two accounts differ on various perspectives. For you see, these two differing views of Israel's history could be described as the prophetic view in Samuel and Kings and the priestly view in Chronicles, whereas Samuel and Kings is especially interested in prophets and prophecies. Chronicles is much more concerned with the temple and its priest. Because of such clear differences, the two accounts will be presented separately in alternating presentations labeled prophetic and priestly. And so as we walk through here, we're going to combine these two together, but we may not make that distinction in the lessons. But as you read Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, you'll understand the difference there. So let's look at the timeline in the life of King Saul. It appears that some of the people of Israel, when when Samuel anointed King Saul king in 1 Samuel 10, they did not accept him. In fact, there were some called the sons of Belial that basically fought against Saul, did not want him to become king. Also, there was a group of people in a village, a city of Jabesh Gilead, that the king Nahash of the Ammonites came up against this city and was going to take the city. They were willing to surrender to this king. Was it because they really didn't care for King Saul, or was it for self protection, self-preservation? I think it probably was the latter. They said, listen, we'll serve you. We'll be your servants. The king says, all right, but part of that is going to be, I want to shame Israel, so we're going to pluck out everybody's right eye. And they said, whoa, wait a second here. We're not sure about this. And they said, give us 7 days. Now, the question is, why 7 days? Why did the king wait 7 days? Some people believe that he didn't think anybody would come. Yeah, they just anointed a king. They just made a king over them, but man, they're still in disarray. They haven't got it together. And so I'm sure he said, sure, go ahead. Nobody's going to come. We'll take over. We'll take the city and no problem. They send a message out. That message comes to King Saul. He unites the people to fight against the Ammonites, and they soundly defeat the Ammonites. And in this great victory, the people want to kill all of those that are against King Saul. But King Saul wisely says, no, we're not going to, no one's going to die today because God has given a great victory. And so this military victory against the Ammonites sort of solidified King Saul as king of Israel. And so we see that at the end of chapter 11, that they anoint King Saul one more time at Gilgal and make him king. And then at the end of the coordination, so to speak, the prophet Samuel in chapter 12 preaches his last national sermon, you could say. And he reminds the people of God's blessings. And he reminds them, again, going back to Deuteronomy. Remember the book of Deuteronomy and this Deuteronomistic history of if you honor God, God will bless you. If you curse God, or if you forsake God, God's going to curse you. Again, in this chapter, he's challenging them and basically tells them, you did wrong for neglecting God for a king. And the people realize it, and they said, oh, we've sinned, ask God to forgive us. And Samuel basically says, this is God's will for you to have a king, but you continue to follow God, and God will bless you. And that's exactly what he challenged, and Samuel sort of leaves the national scene now. He's still there as prophet, but not in the way that he was. And we see chapter 3 opening, and really up to this point, King Saul has been wonderful. But chapter 3 reveals to us the character that was beginning to come out of King Saul. And the Israelites, or King Saul, divides up the armies of God, and 2,000 stays with him in Michmash, and 1,000 stays with Jonathan at Gibeah. And the rest he sends home until he needs them. Now, according to some that have studied the Hebrew text, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but say that 1 Samuel 13:1 is in disarray, the Hebrew text. Now, our King James Version has it, I think, very clear. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel. And so, but I guess in the original Hebrew, it almost indicates that Saul was a year old when he began to reign, and reigned for only 2 years, and that's not really true. However, we do not know how old Saul was when he began to reign, nor what year he uh, became king. Uh, we find some help in Paul's message at Antioch, where he is appealing to Israel's history, and he comments that Saul was king in Israel for 40 years. And this number was also mentioned by the Jewish historian Josephus. But some accept this number as the length of Saul's reign, and therefore, counting backwards 40 years, suppose the date when David became king, around 1010 BC, places Saul's coronation at 1050 BC. Other scholars says, no, that's not a hard and fast number. That is more of a incompleteness. It's basically is a symbolic number. It represents one generation. And so we really don't know exactly when King Saul reigned. As I said, he divided up the armies, and Jonathan um, takes his people, and he goes against the garrison of the army of the Philistines that were stationed at Gibeah. And the Philistines heard of it. Well, it makes them mad because he utterly routed that garrison. And so they gather an army together, and they're going to fight against Israel. And this is exciting, but Samuel says, I will be there, and in 7 days, and I will, at that point, I will offer sacrifice and ask God's blessing. However, the Philistines have come up against the armies, and the people said they are like the sand of the seashore. There's so many. The people got scared. They started running and hiding in caves. Some of them left and went to other lands and they were scared to death. And King Saul, had not come yet from Gilgal, and so they wait for 7 days. Saul has now finally arrived, and they wait, and the prophet Samuel had not come. He delayed his coming. And so Saul says, if I keep waiting any longer, I'm not even going to have an army to fight. And so he says, bring the sacrifices. And he offers the sacrifices, doing exactly against what God had commanded. And it doesn't say when, but I would think soon after that, Samuel comes and says, what have you done? And he says, well, you delayed your coming, and so I went ahead and offered the sacrifices. Samuel says, if you would have waited and trusted in God, God would have established your kingdom forever. But now, because you disobeyed God, he's taken the kingdom from your family. And again, we see here in this chapter that Saul begins to do what would become a habit of his. He blames the people. Well, they were running away. They were scared. I had to bring them together. It's always the people's fault in King Saul's situation. They defeat the Philistines. And the problem comes up that when they go to fight against the Philistines, they don't have any weapons. David, or Jonathan rather, uh, looks at another fortress of the Philistines, and he says, I think I can take them. And so he and his armor bearer goes out, and he says, if they say one thing, we'll go up. If not, then we won't. They go out, and sure enough, they say what they're wanting. They scale this steep cliff. And when they get up to the top, Jonathan and the armor bearer begins to utterly defeat the Philistines. It sends the Philistines into panic. And Saul, there would come a cry, and Saul says, what's happening? And they said, Jonathan's gone. And Saul recognizes Jonathan has climbed up on that cliff to the garrison, to the fortress, and he rallies the people, and they rout the Philistines. But Saul makes a very foolish thing in chapter 14. He says, no one's going to eat anything until we have finished the rout of the Philistines. And the people don't. By the time they finish it that night, the people are absolutely famished. And they tear into the spoils, and they eat the meat without cooking it properly while the blood was still in it, something the Jewish people were forbidden to do. Also, Jonathan, unknowing about his father's command, tired, sees a beehive with honey and dips his end of his staff in it and eats some, and wow, his eyes are open. Man, this is refreshing. But when Saul says, I want to go up and fight them tonight, he consults the priest, and the priest says, no, because somebody has sinned against what you said. When it became known that it was Jonathan, Saul says he will die, and the people says, oh no, he won't. It was by Jonathan's hand that we have this victory. And so the people spared Jonathan. We see in chapter 15 that God is the sin of the Amalekites, or the Amalekites, however you want to say it. I've looked this up. It can be pronounced both ways. He says, it has come to me, King Saul, I want you to utterly destroy the Amalekites. Do not keep anybody. Kill everyone. Women, children, men, everybody, old people. Kill them all. And do not take their flocks. Kill their flocks. Saul goes up to battle. And there was some people living in there, the Kenites. And he said, I'm giving you a chance to get out. If not, you will die with the Amalekites. And Saul goes up against and defeats the Amalekites. And he comes back, and Samuel goes out to meet King Saul. And he declares, I've done all that God wanted. Samuel said, what then is the bleating of the sheep that I hear? And who is this? Standing next to King Saul, and probably tied up, was King Agag. And again, Saul has developed a habit. He said, oh, the people wanted this. The people wanted me to take King Agag as a military victory. The people kept the best of the flock, but Samuel only for a sacrifice to God. Samuel is devastated. And he kills King Agag, cuts him, just whacks him in pieces. And he says, "It repenteth me that I have," God says that it has repented me that I set you up. And the next morning he gets up to go, and King Saul says, don't leave." And Samuel says, "Yes, I must leave." And he said, don't leave. Make this look good to the people." Samuel says, "Saul, God has ripped the kingdom from you." And he says God is more interested in obedience than he is in sacrifice. And what is sad, he goes out. Samuel leaves King Saul. And at the very end of this, he goes out and he does not see King Saul anymore face to face. But he mourns for King Saul. Samuel loves King Saul. I'm going to pause right here. I will be right back. All right, I'm back. My dogs were getting quite worked up and was afraid they would howl on me, so let them out. But Samuel leaves, but he's heavy of heart. He loves Saul. But we find in chapter 16, and I'm not going to take the time to delve all into this, but God sends Samuel down to anoint David king. And then we see that the Spirit of God leaves King Saul and instead gives him a spirit, an evil spirit that troubles him. And so they felt that his servants felt that maybe music might be the way of helping King Saul. So they sought out a man that was cunning or skillful in playing a musical instrument. It could have been a lyre, which is a four-stringed instrument. It could have been a harp. We do know that David did play a harp. But one of the servants had observed or heard of or knew of, according to scripture here, he said, "I have actually seen," in verse 18, "one of the sons of Jesse and the Bethlehemite." And he says he's cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, a man of war and prudent in matters, and comely, a nice looking person. Besides, the Lord is with him. David so impressed King Saul when he came, that King Saul said, "I'm going to make you my armor bearer." And so he was King Saul's armor bearer. But when the evil spirit troubled King Saul, he would play so that the music would calm King Saul. Then we see in chapter 17 that that King Saul is fighting against the Philistines once again, and this is that epic chapter where Goliath, the giant, comes out, and he is tantalizing and causing problems with the Israelites. We will deal with this more when we get to David, but in the next video. But God brings about a great victory with with David, And then in chapter 18, we actually see that David and Jonathan become friends. But David acts very wisely to King Saul and before him as he goes out. And finally, King Saul remembers that he needs to keep his promise to David for killing Goliath. So he promises his daughter. And when the day comes, he gives them to someone else, just in spite, trying to create problems for David, because David has gone out and behaved himself wisely. The people are praising David and saying David has killed his um, his thousands, but Saul has killed um, Saul has killed his hundreds, but David's his thousands. So sorry for pausing it again. This day has not been a good recording day, simply due to the fact that um, my grandkids just walked in a little while ago, and I had to pause it again and then make some and signing some stuff. So hopefully maybe I can finish this without any more interruptions, which is it's all right. It just I feel bad for this. So going back to he was supposed to give his first daughter. He doesn't. Um, and again, let me go back because they were the people were singing, and I got the numbers wrong when the grandkids came in, but in fact, just so that you know, Aiden and Madison, could you come here for a second, real quick? I'll just let you see these little grandkids of mine, and we're going to be getting a third. My daughter's going to have a third child. If she doesn't have it naturally by October the 1st, we will have another one. Aiden and Madison, you want to come here for a second? This was my last interruption. This is little Madison here, and she loves to come and visit Pap and Mamaw. And then Aiden, do you want to step over here? This is my grandson Aiden, and they like to come over and visit with Pap. So you know why I became befuddled. My grandkids came, and I love them and love having them here. So anyway, thank you guys. All right, and all right, now you know why I got befuddled. I enjoy having them and wasn't paying attention. So anyway, they ascribe to Saul. Saul has slain his 1,000, but David his 10,000s, and it began to make Saul jealous. And so again, from here on out, basically, Saul is trying his best to kill David. Um, Again, says he'll give his oldest daughter to David, but he tricks her, and it came to Saul's mind that his youngest daughter, Michal, loved David, and so he said, "All right, I'll give her to David, but I'm going to do it in a sneaky, sly way, almost very much so like Jacob." And he said, I will tell him I'm not going to ask for a dowry, but what I will ask for is if he can get me 100 foreskins of the Philistines, then he can have my daughter. David said, "Oh, that is such a small thing for me to be the king's son-in-law, and I will do it." David goes out, instead of 100, he gets 200 foreskins. And they give them to Saul, and Saul is just overwhelmed and just absolutely got, because he thought for sure David would die. Now David has killed 200 Philistines. And so he does give or Michal, his wife to David, or his daughter to David, and Saul becomes quite concerned because he realizes that God is with David and God is not with Saul, and he becomes David's enemy. And again, for the rest of this point, he's trying to kill David. Yes, he fights with the Philistines, but his main objective is to kill David. And he's upset, and there's a feast, and David was to be there, and he was going to try to kill him. And David stays away in Jonathan's recommendation, and finally he tries to find out. There was another situation where David was supposed to be sick, and Micah puts an image in the bed and covers it, and they come to find out that it was an image that Saul's own daughter deceived him to spare David's life. And then there's this feast, and David asked to go back to Bethlehem for a family deal, and Saul becomes upset, and he demands that David be killed. Jonathan has set up with arrows a communication system. When the lad goes back, Jonathan meets with David, tells him that my dad is out to kill you. You need to run and hide. And they were close friends, and they put a covenant between themselves. And Jonathan knew that David was going to be king, and he was all right with that. I don't have time to deal with that, but that is a tremendous thought. And it almost as if he knew something bad was going to happen to him. He says, David, if anything bad happens to me, will you take care of and remember my house? David flees, and he goes to Nob, and there they give him the showbread that was before the Lord, and gives him Goliath's sword, which was there. And Saul was so insanely jealous of David that he finds out, and he kills the priest of Nob. And David's running. He's hiding out in the Israelite territories, and Saul is seeking him. And twice Saul comes close to where David was. David had a golden opportunity to kill Saul, and no one would notice, but he would not touch God's anointed. And Saul repents, but this jealousy has so eaten him alive that he can't do anything but pursue David. And finally, David, and we'll deal with some of the chapters that I'm missing here, but David finally realizes he can't stay in Israel. And so he goes to live among the Philistines, figuring that Saul would not bother him anymore. And he falls into favor with the king of the Philistines. And Melch, king of Gath. And he loves David, and he's also Achish, actually is the king's name. I'm sorry, he was the son of Melch, king of Gath, and Achish gives Ziklag for David to live in, and David lives in the country of the Philistines a full year and 4 months. And however, the Philistines have gathered to fight against Israel. And David is going to go and fight with the Philistines. But according to Achish's wish, but um, some of his commanders says no, he's not going. They'll get in a battle and he'll turn on us. No way. And so uh, King Achish sends David back to Ziklag. And I won't go any farther there, but Saul is in distress. Samuel has died. And God has left him. And he's concerned about this battle. And so he seeks a witch. And prior to this, Saul had killed all the witches. And but he finds this lady of Endor. And he goes to her. And she says, "What spirit do you want me to call up from the dead?" And he says, "Bring up Samuel." And the spirit of Samuel arises. Now, I don't understand all of this. Some scholars have debated it. Some scholars actually believe that Samuel reappeared to King Saul. Others, was it just his spirit? But Samuel has a message. The spirit of Samuel has a message. You're going to die. And God has ripped the kingdom from you. And when the witch realized who it was that was seeking Samuel, she was fearful. But Saul promised her he wouldn't hurt her. And they give him meat, and he refuses to eat, but finally he did, and he goes his way. And chapter 30 basically deals with David destroying the Amalekites that King Saul should have destroyed. In fact, this is the first reference to a group of Ammonites after King Saul was to kill the Ammonites. But the next day, after the witch of Endor, Saul goes out into the battle, and he is sorely wounded by an archer. And the Philistines are coming upon him, and he would rather die by the sword of someone that was his friend. And so he begs his armor bearer to kill him, but his armor bearer would not. And so 1 Samuel ends with saying that Saul takes out his own sword and falls on it and kills himself on Mount Gilboa. And his sons die with him. Now, what is interesting is we end this video and this lecture is when 2 Samuel opens, there is an Amalekite or Amalekite that comes to David and declares that he killed King Saul. Maybe thinking that he would score points with David. David has him killed. And so again, you can see that Saul did not kill the Amalekites. They keep popping up. All the way, as some believe, that Haman was a descendant of King Agag and sought to destroy the Israelites. So that ends our video for this part of 1 Kings, or 1 Samuel rather. And the next video we will pick up with the life of David. We will go back into 1 Samuel and cover some of the things that I missed, cover that epic story in 1 Samuel 17 of David killing Goliath. And then we'll give you the overview of the book of 2 Samuel. And then the following video, we will tell the life of King David. Thank you for listening, and thank you for putting up with the interruptions. My bad. And when my grandkids come, I get excited about them coming. And when they were coming back to find Pap Pap, as they call me, I lost my train of thought. So I apologize about that. But thank you until next week. God bless you, and trust that you've learned something from the life of King Saul.